I was never the kind of woman who asked for much. Honestly, I didn't have time for it. I raised my son alone, just me, my stubborn will, and whatever scraps life threw my way. There were nights I went to bed with an empty stomach so he could have seconds. I worked 2, sometimes 3 jobs. Laundry during the day, cleaning offices at night. I gave him everything I had, even the parts of myself I should have saved. And still, I didn't see it coming. Losing my job felt like the world suddenly forgot I existed. They said it was downsizing, but I knew better. I'd seen the looks when my hands started trembling, when I needed a little more time on the register. Suddenly, 58 made me invisible. I thought coming home to my son, to the house I helped put a roof on, would be my safety net. Turns out I was just an extra item in his well-decorated life. His words still sting, even now. "We need space," he said, like I was clutter. Like I was some old coat he'd outgrown. His wife stood there, arms crossed, saying nothing, but her silence roared louder than any scream. I asked where they thought I should go, and he shrugged. Shrugged. As if it was nothing. As if I was nothing. The son I raised with my own cracked hands, now telling me I was a burden. So I packed in silence. 1 small suitcase, no photos, no keepsakes, no dignity. I left behind the curtains I sewed by hand, the kitchen I used to sing in, the tiny rose bush I planted for my mother. He didn't even watch me go. Not a hug, not a thank you, just the soft click of the door behind me. And in that quiet, something inside me cracked, not loud or dramatic, just a clean, quiet break. The kind you feel before you even realize something's missing. I walked for a while that night. No destination, no plan, just me and the sound of my own footsteps, echoing louder than my thoughts. The air had that crisp bite that settles into your bones, and I welcomed it. At least it reminded me I was still here, still breathing. I remember passing a bakery, watching a young girl inside laughing as she frosted cupcakes. She couldn't have known, but that little laugh cut straight through me. Joy felt like a foreign language I'd once spoken fluently. I ended up at a bus stop with a bench that smelled like rain and rust. I sat there, clutching my suitcase like it might anchor me to something real. A man nearby was arguing with someone on the phone. Something about rent, about betrayal. I didn't mean to eavesdrop, but his pain mirrored mine so perfectly it felt like we were reading the same chapter of 2 different books. Funny how strangers can sometimes feel closer than family. That night, I didn't cry. Not because I wasn't hurting, believe me, I was, but because I'd cried too many times before. This was different. This was the kind of pain that settles into your skin, like ink, like it wants to write itself into your story whether you like it or not. I wrapped my coat tighter around me and promised myself I'd survive. Maybe not tomorrow, maybe not next week, but somehow, some way, I would find a way to keep standing. Because here's the thing, no one tells you about heartbreak. It doesn't always come from lovers. Sometimes it comes from the very people you built your life around. And when it does, it breaks something deeper than your heart. It shakes your belief in the world. But even in that moment, humiliated, discarded, alone, I felt something flicker in me. It wasn't anger, not yet, just the quiet beginning of a flame I didn't know I still had. I found a place to sleep that night. A church shelter with thin blankets and thicker silence. The woman at the desk didn't ask questions, just handed me a clipboard and a weak smile. I filled out the form with shaky hands, skipping the parts that asked for an emergency contact. Who would I even put? I used to be his emergency contact. Now I was just a name that didn't fit anywhere. I chose the top bunk. Safer that way. Harder to disappear when you're closer to the ceiling. Lying there, listening to the coughs, the snores, the quiet weeping in the dark, I let my mind wander to simpler things. The smell of cinnamon in December. The way my son used to tug on my sleeve when he was scared. His tiny hand in mine, how natural it once felt. That same hand now shooing me out the door like a stranger. I clung to those old memories like a frayed lifeline, not because they comforted me, but because they reminded me I had mattered once. People always say, a mother's love is unconditional. But what they don't tell you is how rare it is for that love to be returned. Not everyone grows up to be kind. Not every child remembers. Sometimes they outgrow you like an old story, one they're embarrassed to tell at dinner parties. I didn't raise my son to be cruel, but somewhere along the way, he stopped looking at me and started looking through me. That, I think, is the sharpest kind of betrayal. Not being hated, but being erased. But I wasn't ready to disappear. Not yet. That flame, the one that flickered quietly when I left, it hadn't gone out. It was small, yes, but it was mine. And even as I lay in that cold bunk, in a room full of strangers, something inside me whispered, "This isn't the end." It might not look like it now, but something was beginning. Something slow. Something quiet. Something I didn't have a name for. Not yet. The first place I stayed for more than a night was a friend's couch. One of those friends you lose touch with over the years, but who somehow still shows up when the world forgets your name. Her apartment was small, always smelled faintly of vanilla and laundry soap. I folded my clothes neatly every morning, made her coffee before she woke up. I didn't want to be a burden again. I couldn't go through that twice. I started looking for work. Anything, really. But when you're a woman past 50, with no recent references and a tremor in your hands, even the simplest jobs come with closed doors. I almost gave up. Then one afternoon, I saw an ad online. Need help with tutoring, reading and writing, remote, flexible hours. I clicked it, thinking it was a long shot, but they called me back within the hour. A young mother, exhausted, desperate, said her kid couldn't read full sentences and school wasn't helping. I didn't realize how much I'd missed teaching. The rhythm of words, the quiet "oh" when something clicks. I used to help my son with his homework at the kitchen table, remember? Flashcards and gold star stickers. I brought that same energy to this little boy. Cheerful praise, silly voices, gentle corrections. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel invisible. I felt needed. I felt good. One client turned into 2, then 4. Then someone's cousin called, and before I knew it, I had a schedule. Not glamorous, not steady, but it was something. Every time I clicked join meeting on my old laptop, I felt a small bloom of purpose. My hands still shook sometimes, but the kids didn't care. They liked the way I laughed when they got something right. And somewhere between phonics lessons and reading fables, I started to feel like I belonged in my own story again. Money was still tight, of course. I clipped coupons like it was an Olympic sport, walked instead of taking the bus, counted coins at the checkout. But I started baking again, something I hadn't done in years. It began with a banana bread I made to thank my friend. She posted a photo online, and somehow that led to an order from her neighbor, then another. Before long, people were messaging me asking, "Do you do carrot cake?" I hadn't felt that kind of buzz in ages. I sold things in recycled boxes, tied with whatever ribbon I could find in old drawers. The cakes weren't perfect, but they were made with care, and people could taste that. Each bite was a piece of my hope, kneaded and baked into something warm. I didn't make much, but it gave me a reason to get up, a reason to keep going. Every order felt like a quiet thank you from the universe, like maybe I wasn't forgotten after all. Then one day, a woman I didn't recognize messaged me. She said she'd tried one of my muffins at a birthday party and loved it. Said she ran a little bookstore cafe a few blocks over, and would I be interested in supplying pastries once a week? I nearly dropped my phone. I reread the message 10 times, scared I'd imagined it. But it was real. She believed in my hands before I fully believed in them again. And that kind of faith? That sticks to your ribs. We met the next day. Her name was Alma. She had laugh lines and ink-stained fingers and eyes that saw straight through to the parts of me I thought were long buried. She didn't ask about my past, just wanted to know if I could handle 30 croissants by Friday. I said yes before I even knew how I'd do it, and just like that, something began to shift. Not fast, not flashy, but real. Something I could build on, one sweet thing at a time. Every Friday, I delivered the pastries myself. I liked the ritual. The walk, the smells of paper and espresso in the cafe, the way Alma greeted me like an old friend. It wasn't just business, it was healing. She let me leave a few flyers near the counter. Little hand-drawn ads for tutoring and baked goods. Nothing fancy. But week by week, people called. They came. My name started to mean something again. Not as his mother, not as someone's past, just me. I still checked social media now and then, an old habit I hadn't quite shaken. My son's posts were different now. Fewer smiles, tense captions, pictures that felt forced. I noticed his wife had stopped tagging him in anything. Then her profile disappeared altogether. I didn't feel joy, not really. But I'd be lying if I said there wasn't a quiet satisfaction in watching it unfold, like some invisible hand was gently tipping the scales back toward balance. I never commented, never liked a post, just watched from a distance, quiet and steady. I'd learned by then that some battles aren't worth fighting head-on. Some lessons only sink in when the noise fades and all that's left is the echo of your own choices. I didn't want revenge. I wanted clarity. And more than anything, I wanted to remember who I was before I forgot myself in the role of caretaker, of giver, of forgotten woman in the corner of someone else's life. One night, after boxing up a batch of blueberry scones, I sat by the window with a cup of tea and whispered something I hadn't said out loud in years. "I'm proud of you." I meant it. I think I even smiled. And just like that, the world felt a little less heavy. But as I stared out into the quiet dark, I couldn't help but think. The past wasn't finished with me yet. Not by a long shot. It happened so quietly, I almost didn't notice. One afternoon, Alma handed me a check that was bigger than usual. A thank you bonus, she called it. "You've doubled our traffic on weekends," she said with a wink. I didn't know what to say. I just stood there, mouth slightly open, heart pounding like someone had handed me a second chance disguised as paper. That night, I opened an envelope I'd been too afraid to touch, a small savings account I'd started months ago. I added the check. And for the first time in years, I felt something close to security. The tutoring kept growing too. One of the kids' moms worked in publishing and said, "Have you ever thought about writing a workbook? Parents like yours would eat it up." I laughed, but the idea planted itself like a seed. I started jotting things down between baking orders and bedtime. Little tips, exercises, stories. I didn't know if it would amount to anything, but it felt good to create again, to stretch beyond survival, to imagine something more than just getting by. By spring, I had enough to move into a small studio, just mine. No one's couch, no shared fridge or borrowed towels. It had peeling paint and a leaky faucet, but I cried the first night I slept there, not from sadness, but from the sheer relief of belonging. I bought flowers for the window, lavender, my favorite, the same kind I used to grow near the porch of that house. Funny how some things circle back, even when you're not looking for them. I kept quiet about my progress. No announcements, no declarations. I wasn't building a life to prove anyone wrong. I was building it because I could. Still, when I heard through a neighbor that my son had lost his job, something about a bad investment and some legal mess, I felt something shift inside me. Not pity, not triumph, just a kind of stillness, like the air right before a storm rolls in. And I knew the story between us wasn't over yet. I found out the house was up for sale through a listing my friend sent me. "Isn't this your old place?" she asked. I clicked the link and just stared. The photos were glossy and cold, all gray paint and bad staging, like someone tried to scrub the soul right out of it. But I knew every corner. I could still picture the scuff marks by the stairs from when my son learned to walk, the dent in the wall from when we moved the old bookshelf. That house had bones, and they were mine. I didn't hesitate. I called Alma, who knew someone, a lawyer, discreet and fast. "Make an offer," I told her, through the business name. No attention. My voice didn't even shake. That surprised me. A year ago, I couldn't ask a barista for extra sugar without apologizing. Now I was buying back the house I was thrown out of, and I did it like I was ordering fresh inventory. Not out of spite, but because it was time. It was mine before it was ever theirs. The deal closed quickly. Quieter than I expected. One signature, one wire transfer, and suddenly, I was holding the deed like it was an apology the world had forgotten to give me. I didn't visit right away. I wasn't sure I was ready. Instead, I had the locks changed, the garden cleared, the rooms aired out. I asked for the lavender to be replanted near the porch. I didn't want it to look new. I wanted it to look right, like a woman had come home, but on her own terms. Weeks later, I got the message, a rental inquiry. My son, desperate for a place to stay, he didn't recognize the business name on the listing, just saw a price he could afford, a location he knew too well, and a note, room available, quiet tenants preferred. I sat there, staring at the message for a long time. Then I typed back, available for immediate move-in, welcome. No signature, no warning, just an open door, like the one he once closed behind me. He moved in on a Thursday. Same black duffel he always used for trips, now sagging with wear and disappointment. He looked older, not in the way years age a person, but in the way regret does, in the slope of the shoulders, the cautious steps. I watched from the upstairs window, unseen. He didn't look around much, didn't smile, just walked inside like a man who'd run out of places to run. Part of me wanted to burst through the door to shout, "Do you see now?" But I stayed still. This wasn't about revenge. It was about the lesson. He never asked who owned the house, not once. Maybe he didn't care. Maybe pride kept him from wondering. Or maybe he just couldn't bear the answer. I rented the room to him under a different name, through a third party. The kitchen had new appliances, the walls were painted. But I left one thing untouched. The living room clock. It ticked the same uneven rhythm it always had. I wondered if he noticed, if that sound stirred anything buried in him. He was quieter now. Polite, distant, he cooked his own meals, kept to himself. I passed him in the hall once when I came by as the property manager. He didn't even blink, just nodded, eyes low, voice flat. He didn't recognize me, or maybe he didn't want to. Grief can wear many faces. I didn't speak either. Not yet. Not until he was ready. Because this wasn't a punishment. It was preparation. A slow, deliberate space for truth to rise. But I started making small changes, just enough to stir the air. A framed photo placed back on a shelf, one of him as a child holding a paper crown. A familiar mug in the cupboard. My lavender in bloom near the porch. I wanted him to feel it before he could name it. To sense me like a shadow he couldn't place. Because sometimes, before you confront a ghost, you need to live in the house it still haunts. He settled into the house like a man trying not to leave footprints. I could see it in the way he moved. Quiet, unsure, almost apologetic. He kept his door closed most days, worked odd hours I couldn't quite follow, and avoided the common areas unless necessary. There was a weight to him now, one I hadn't seen before. Not shame exactly, just exhaustion. The kind that doesn't come from work, but from carrying years of your own bad decisions. I visited once a week under the guise of property inspections. Wore my hair tied back, glasses I never needed, a clipboard I didn't write on. Each time he greeted me with polite distance. "Ma'am," he'd say. "Ma'am," as if he were speaking to a stranger. It didn't sting like I thought it would. In a strange way, it gave me time, space to watch, to understand the man he'd become without the noise of history between us. And what I saw wasn't cruelty. It was collapse. He never complained. Not when the hot water sputtered, not when the mail piled up, not even when the power went out one night during a storm. He lit a candle and sat by the window for hours. I watched from the curb, engine running, wondering what he was thinking. Maybe he was counting regrets. Maybe he was just tired of the dark. Either way, he didn't look like the boy I raised or the man who cast me out. He looked hollow, like something had been scooped out and never refilled. Still, I waited. Left things where he might find them. An old recipe card tucked in a drawer, the radio station I used to love preset on the kitchen dial. Not too much, just echoes. I wanted to see if he'd feel the walls remembering, if he'd start to suspect that the past wasn't as far away as he thought. And maybe, just maybe, I wanted him to feel what I had once felt. That eerie silence between knowing something has shifted and not yet understanding how or why. The change came slowly. One evening, he lingered in the living room, staring at a photo I'd placed carefully on the mantel. It was a candid one, him as a child, sitting in my lap, frosting on his nose, both of us laughing like the world couldn't touch us. He didn't touch the frame, just stood there, staring, like something familiar was tapping on the door of his memory. He blinked fast, rubbed the back of his neck, and walked away. But I saw it. The crack. The doubt. Later that week, I planted more lavender by the steps. He paused when he saw it, bent down. Ran his fingers along a blossom, like he recognized the shape, the smell, but couldn't place it. He didn't say anything, but he lingered outside longer than usual that morning, sipping his coffee slowly, eyes on the porch. I watched from behind the curtains upstairs, breath held. He looked like someone trying to remember a dream they'd been told never happened. He started asking quiet questions. Did the owner grow up here? Is that clock original? Was this place always this quiet? I answered carefully, just enough truth to make it feel solid, just enough distance to keep him from seeing the whole picture. It's been in the same hands a long time, I told him once, and his eyes narrowed, like he heard something in my voice he couldn't name. Not suspicion, not certainty, just a stir. And then it happened. He found the letter. I'd left it folded in the drawer of the nightstand in his room, the one I knew he'd eventually check when looking for a charger or a pen. It wasn't dramatic, just a single page, in my handwriting, signed with my full name. No accusations, no anger, just the facts. This is the house I built, the one you sent me away from. And now it's yours again, but on my terms. He didn't come out of his room for hours after that. The air in the house shifted, like something sacred had finally been unearthed. The next morning, he was in the kitchen before I was. Coffee brewed, 2 mugs set out, one of them the blue ceramic one I used to drink from every morning, the one with the tiny chip on the handle. He didn't say a word when I walked in, just looked at me, eyes red-rimmed, jaw clenched like he was holding back a storm. I poured my coffee in silence. We stood there, 2 ghosts in a house that remembered everything. When he finally spoke, his voice was hoarse. Why? That's all he managed. Not how, not when. Just that one word, cracked and bare. I looked at him, really looked, and saw the boy I once rocked to sleep, the man who'd once told me to leave, and the stranger who'd come back asking for shelter without realizing whose door he'd knocked on. And for a moment I didn't answer. I wanted the silence to do its work. Then I told him. Because you threw me out of the house I helped build, and now you'll pay to live in it. I didn't flinch when I said it. I didn't have to. His face dropped, not with anger, with something heavier, something raw. So this is revenge? He asked, quieter this time. I shook my head. No. If it were, you wouldn't be standing here. Revenge would have been slamming the door on you the way you did to me. This is something else entirely. He didn't respond, just nodded slowly, like the weight of it was settling across his shoulders. I didn't need to push. He was already in the middle of the reckoning, and I had no interest in rushing it. I let him sit with it, with the truth, with the sting. Because the real lesson wasn't in the confrontation. It was in what came after. And I knew, if he stayed, if he was willing, the hardest part was still ahead. He tried to apologize the next day, fumbling through a mess of words like someone searching for a language they hadn't spoken in years. I didn't know, he said. I was stressed. We thought. I stopped him gently. You didn't think that was the problem. My voice wasn't angry, just steady, tired maybe, but clear. I didn't want excuses. I'd lived inside the consequences long enough. What I needed was something real, something earned. He looked small, not physically, but in that quiet way someone shrinks when their illusions fall apart. He asked if I was going to kick him out. I said no. That would have been easy. This wasn't about punishment. It was about understanding, about giving him what I never got, a second chance. But I made one thing clear. This time, he would work for the roof over his head. Not with money alone, but with time, with effort, with humility. You'll pay rent, I told him. You'll help in the garden, and once a week you'll volunteer at the community center. No arguments. He didn't push back, just nodded, eyes down, shame clinging to him like smoke. That was new. The old him would have stormed out, called it unfair. But now? He just accepted it. I think deep down, he knew it was more grace than he deserved. And I wasn't doing it for him. I was doing it for me, to close the loop, to reclaim what was mine, not just the house, but my worth. The first Saturday, I found him on his knees pulling weeds, sweat on his back, dirt on his hands. It looked good on him, not because he was suffering, but because he was finally present, finally quiet. He didn't see me watching through the screen door, but in that moment, I realized something. Sometimes the greatest revenge isn't cruelty, it's the invitation to grow, and the choice to stay and do the work. The weeks passed quietly. We spoke little, but the silence between us began to soften. He started cooking dinner now and then. Nothing fancy, just pasta or rice and beans. One night he left a plate outside my door. Didn't knock, didn't say anything, but I ate every bite. It wasn't an apology, not really. Just a gesture, a beginning. Sometimes beginnings are the hardest things to recognize. They come dressed as routine, wrapped in quiet acts. At the community center, he taught kids how to fix bicycles. I never asked how that started, but I heard about it from Alma, of all people. There's a man there who reminds me of someone, she said with a half smile, handing me a croissant. I smiled back but didn't explain. I didn't owe the world that story yet. It was still growing, still raw. And some things need time to settle before you give them names like forgiveness or redemption. One night, he came home with grease on his hands and a light in his eyes I hadn't seen since he was a boy. "The kids love it," he said, almost to himself. I nodded. "Good," I answered. That was all. No fanfare, no long talks. We weren't ready for that. But the way he looked at me, not like a tenant, not like a stranger, told me he was beginning to see what he hadn't before, that love doesn't disappear when it's thrown away. It waits, and it watches. Still, there were moments when the past poked through. I'd walk into a room and find him staring at an old photo, or sitting too still, eyes far off. Maybe he was revisiting that day, the one he told me to leave. Maybe he was wondering who he could have been if he hadn't. But I never interrupted those moments. They belonged to him, just like my silence once belonged to me. And sometimes, healing means letting someone sit with what they broke, long enough to understand how to put it back together. One morning, I found him in the hallway, broom in hand, sweeping the floor with quiet focus. He looked up at me, almost startled, like he wasn't used to being seen in those small, decent moments. "Do you want me to repaint the door frame?" he asked. His voice was steady now. Not eager to impress, not desperate to be forgiven, just present. I nodded, not because the door frame needed it, but because he did. Sometimes we repaint things to prove we can treat them better the second time. Later that day, he handed me a folded sheet of paper. No envelope, just creases and fingerprints. Inside was a handwritten note. No excuses, just memories, gratitude, regret. And a line I wasn't expecting. "You raised me once, but I never learned how to become a man. I think this house is trying to teach me now." My throat closed. I didn't cry. I just sat down with the note in my lap and let it rest there, like something fragile I wasn't quite ready to let go of. I never told him I forgave him. Some things don't need to be said out loud. They live in the way I started baking more than I needed to, knowing he'd take an extra muffin for the road, in the way he watered the lavender without being asked, in the quiet dinners shared at the same table, no longer on opposite sides of memory. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. And real, I've learned, is more precious than easy. So I gave him one last rule, just one. I wrote it on a sticky note and left it on the fridge. This house raised you once. Maybe this time it can teach you how to be a man. He never said a word about it, but I saw him reading it, again and again, and for the first time since I walked away with nothing but a suitcase, I knew I'd finally come home.